All right, let's talk about the Anabaptists. The term literally means rebaptizer. In a formal sense, the movement started in a village near Zurich in January of 1525. But other scholars have argued for like a polygenesis, so like many starting points of the movement, which has been really well received. And I would actually agree with that. And the Anabaptist movement did not begin as any sort of cohesive movement either. So let's talk a little bit about this. So Luther brings the sacraments down to two: baptism and Lord's Supper. And Luther sees these sacraments different than the Catholics see them, okay? Now, it should be kind of no surprise that people will question both of these sacraments as Luther defined them. If we're questioning the Catholic definition of them, then it makes sense that people are going to start questioning all these definitions that are coming out, all right? So people are wondering, like, how should they be administered? What is their purpose, all right? So people are reading Luther, they're reading Zwingli, and then they're going to their Bibles, which are finally available to people. You remember in the Middle Ages, they were like actually chained to churches. Now, because of the printing press, people, and not just like exorbitantly rich people, can actually get their hands on Bibles, okay? And so they can go to those Bibles, and they're coming up with lots of different like questions and ideas about scripture, about correct practices. And baptism becomes kind of a point of discussion in the Reformation. Like, what is the point of baptism? How are we going to do baptism? So I am not an Anabaptist. I'm a Catholic, as you know. But I do understand how they get there. I actually went to a Baptist seminary for my MA. If you look at the Bible and if you look at the early church, the majority of people were being baptized as adults, okay? Lutherans and Anabaptists see baptism as two fundamentally different things. Lutherans see baptism as God's promise, okay? So God is doing the action, all right? Whereas with the Anabaptists, you have this believer's baptism, okay? It is a human action. It is the believer saying, like, I am a Christian, I am choosing this, and so they are baptized, okay? See how different these definitions of baptism are. It's why there's a lot of conflict between groups that do infant baptism and those who do adult baptism, because there's just a fundamentally different view of seeing the sacrament, okay? So let's talk a little bit about these Anabaptists, especially the ones around Zurich. They had been followers of Zwingli, and they wanted to introduce a believer's baptism. About 30 of these people were rebaptized, and then they were arrested by the city of Zurich. Most recanted, but some didn't, and they were expelled from the city. And what that did is they were just sort of sending these people out in the world to spread their message. Okay? The Anabaptists kind of believed they were the true believers, all right? This is a mark of a true believer, the adult baptism. And they were persecuted from the earliest days. It is very, very possible they got some of their numbers from those disillusioned peasants after the whole Peasants' War. And within these communities, there's a very strong emphasis on living a Christian life. You know, while other reformers were kind of arguing about bits of theology, the Anabaptists were really talking about faith in Christian living, not so much these like kind of abstract theological concepts. And this really helped them gain followers. In fact, there were actually very few theologically inclined early Anabaptists, but their message was very, very enthusiastic. It was very spiritual in nature. It was very appealing, okay? And their evangelism was simple. They would go into a town, they would baptize some new believers, they'd set up a new church, and then these evangelists would leave. The new Baptists the new believers would be more or less on their own from that point. This is a very, very different situation than, say, Luther had. The Anabaptists would study the Bible, whatever pamphlets might come their way. They were, in a sense, kind of these little church islands that were connected through this larger network of Anabaptist believers. There were 3 gatherings in the year 1527 to discuss doctrine amongst the Anabaptist group. One of these meetings was at Schleitheim on the German-Swiss border, and they produced a theological document called the Brotherly Agreement that ended up being a major kind of Anabaptist doctrine of the South German Swiss area. The Schleitheim Confession formulated these theological touchstones, but they were not binding, okay? So up on the screen I have them. So some of these touchstones are baptism after confession of faith. All right, so obviously you have to be older to do that. The Lord's Supper as a memorial meal. So again, kind of the symbolic view of communion. The ban, or so you might know it better as like the shunning, okay? The pastoral nature of the ministerial office. Non-resistance or disavowal of the use of force. So they were pacifists. And then the refusal to swear oaths. How did this differ from other groups, and why were they seen as so subversive? All right, number one, remember, baptism and citizenship at this time are bound up together. So if you are not baptizing people until they're older, they're not getting their citizenship, all right? So this is causing like instability in the social order, okay? They refuse to bear arms or occupy government offices. People don't like this. They won't swear oaths, which also challenged the societal order. This screamed insurrection to the leadership, okay? And put on the heels of the Peasant War, people in power were not liking this. And then it was just an underground movement because of the nature of it and the fact that it was illegal. Okay, so what did an Anabaptist congregation look like? You know, it was this loose network of underground churches, and the clergy in general was not formally trained. All right. I need to mention the disastrous Moonster incident because it was an utter catastrophe for the early movement, and it has very long-term effects on the Anabaptist. Okay. So the city of Moonster was about 10,000 people, and the Anabaptists became a recognized religion in the community, which of course was very, very unusual at the time. And they ended up taking political control of the city. Now, I'm going to leave off the rather complicated political happenings that led to this unlikely situation. But what you need to know is that all the Catholics in Moonster were kicked out of the city or left of their own free will. The Anabaptists were in control politically, which is really actually antithetical to their very nature. But I digress. And the people started to see Moonster as a new Jerusalem. So in the year 1534, a 24-year-old tailor named Jan van Lieden was convinced that God had called him to lead the community as a third King David. Meanwhile, because they'd kicked all the Catholics out of the city and taken political control, the Siege of Munster had begun. And it was led by Catholic Bishop von Franz Waldeck and Philip of Hesse. Yes, the Philip of Hesse you were reading about in your book of the Holy Roman Empire. And also you might be wondering, hey, these are Catholics and Lutherans working together. Yes, in this unusual moment of ecumenical cooperation, Lutherans and Catholics came together to crush the Anabaptists and sack Moonster. Kind of meanwhile, back in Moonster, while the siege is happening, private property is abolished, polygamy is introduced, and by the end of the siege, there was an estimated 2,000 men and 5,000 women left. Actually, this is the reason they introduced polygamy. Women had no rights because all these men were dying in the war. They had just an excess number of widows, and instead of, like, say, giving women some rights, they decided that men should just be allowed to marry multiple women, and this would solve the problem. All right. Anyway, so in 1535, the sieging forces took the city. All the men in the city were killed, and all the women and children were expelled from the city. If you can imagine, this was utterly catastrophic, and this already persecuted group faced far, far more troubles. Now, enter into this, you have Mano Simmons, okay? He is the one who really brings stability back to this movement. All right. He was born in the Holy Roman Empire in 1496 in what is now the Netherlands. Okay. He became a priest, but struggled with the idea of infant baptism. He ended up leaving the church and is ordained an Anabaptist. And he chose to convert at literally the worst time ever, 1536. Okay, right when all this Moonster stuff is going on and the fallout is happening from this, okay? But he's the one who added stability and respectability to the faith once again. He led a shift in belief that led the remaining Anabaptists to really salvage this tradition, okay? He focused on the marvel of Christian new birth, the sanctified life, and peacefulness, okay? The church was supposed to be without spots and wrinkles was the term he used. So a church of true believers. The Moonster incident really forced this group to move away from the idea of like end times and focus more on the here and now. Quietism became a hallmark of the movement. Now, the modern Baptists, which have been super influential in American Christianity, are actually not direct descendants of the Anabaptists. There is obviously influence from the Anabaptists, but the Baptists grow out of the English Reform movements. Kind of the true heirs to Simmons and the Anabaptists are actually the Mennonites and the Amish.